who's on Periscope here, can you hear Kim talking in the background, or do I need to turn it up?
We are checking in to see
Hey,
if people can hear on Periscope on both sides.
Okay.
Cool. Awesome. I'm so excited. Can you guys on my end on Periscope, can you on my Periscope hear Crystal?
Hey there. Check, check. 1, 2.
Check 1, 2. Somebody say yes. Somebody say yes if you can hear her. They can hear you. Awesome. They can hear you. Cool. So those of you that watched part 1 and you know what we are doing, if somebody jumps on or joins this broadcast and they don't know what we're doing, if you could tell them, that would be awesome, because I'm not going to be able to. I'll be talking to Crystal. Excellent.
So, in just a little bit, my husband is coming back from the store, so I have my daughter down here, so if I disappear, that's why.
No problem. I definitely can relate to that. And awesome. So those of you that are just joining, my name is Kim Greco, and I own a dog training business called Paws and Possibilities, and I have created an online dog training program called Manners Matter. And tonight we're talking to Crystal, and I'm going to ask Crystal, if you would take a moment just to also introduce yourself to us.
Definitely. So my name's Crystal Blaker. I live in Tucson, Arizona, and I have a dog training company called Rough House Dog Training. My little logo right here. Also one in the background for my periscopers back there. And I do group classes, puppy training, basic obedience, intermediate, advanced, all that fun stuff, and then also behavior modification. So as you mentioned on part 1 of your periscope about the reinforcing bad behaviors, I was like, ah! So sent you a message, and we're here. So for those of you that are on Periscope, Ryan specifically, if you don't know, here talking with Kim Greco, and just to kind of discuss about making sure we're not reinforcing unwanted behaviors from our dogs. So that's what we'll be discussing. So for those of you that are just joining on Periscope too, welcome. Feel free to tap the screen, show some hearts, and one fun thing that she said too is if you hear either of us say reinforce, tap the screen a bunch of times, so that way it'll just be a fun game for you to make sure that you guys are paying attention.
My guys are tapping.
What's that?
They're all tapping hearts because you said reinforce.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Awesome.
Cool. And if you guys have questions on Periscope, feel free to ask that. When my husband comes too, I'll try to reposition the camera so you can see Kim talking as well. But I have to get something set up over here to put my stand on. So
awesome. So I wanted to. I did a Periscope. I talked about people who were getting advice from dog trainers, basically about inadvertently or by accident they're reinforcing their dogs for stuff that they didn't want. And and honestly, several other dog trainers reached out to me after they watched that Periscope with some questions about, like, well, wait a minute, because if you really stop to think about it, like, there are times where people felt like they were doing that. And so I want to talk a little bit about it. I definitely wanted to answer your questions. I thought this would be a good platform, a good way to do it, to back and forth between you and I.
Yeah. Totally.
And we'll just let these guys watch along with us, which I thought would be fun.
Yeah, and then they can obviously add in questions too as we talk about it.
Sure. I have, so my background, I spent 10 years as a dolphin trainer. And during that time had the luxury of working lots of different types of marine mammals, but really became an expert at using positive reinforcement to interact with animals, right? Any kind of animals. And as a dog trainer, I am very passionately attached to using a balanced approach to training. I think it is super important to tell the dogs when they're doing something right, of course, but it's just as important to tell them when they're doing something wrong. And so what we talked about originally that ran into, like, all these questions is, well, what happens when the dog is doing something wrong? How can you distract them or divert them or interact with them in a way where you could get them to stop doing something wrong, but you're not then accidentally reinforcing them, which is what I was talking about.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to start with saying, because the topic gets a little confusing. Hello down there. Right. The topic gets confusing. I get it. But I think that learning something from the way we train dolphins, and I'll share that with you now, it really helps to understand where I'm coming from with what I was talking about, accidentally reinforcing dogs for the wrong behavior. So we call it an LRS, which stands for the least reinforcing stimulus. So if I'm out training a dolphin and I'm limited into using only positive reinforcement in my interactions with that animal for a variety of reasons, and the dolphin does something wrong, what do? We all sort of got together as the marine mammal industry and sort of decided that the best of the work, like the best thing to do, is we would do what we refer to as an LRS, the least reinforcing stimulus. So for training a dolphin, what that looked like was 3 seconds of standing in front of them doing nothing. 3 seconds of boring. Have you ever seen a dolphin show?
Yeah.
Out of curiosity. Okay, so if I send a dolphin on a behavior and they do it right, I'll click them. So we blow a whistle, but it's the same as clicker training.
Yeah.
I blow the whistle, and the dolphin comes back. If you've seen it, you know, like, we act all goofy, we're all kind of excited, very animated in receiving the animal. So when they swim back to the deck, their normal of what they're used to is eye contact, attention, upbeat, interaction, kind of hyper, focused, really alert and aware, like really solid connection, right? So can you imagine if you're a dolphin and you're used to swimming back up to the deck and getting that, how drastically different it would be if you swam back over to the deck and when you popped up, you got this.
Right. But then my question would be, so if the dolphin did something, say, inappropriate, whatever that might be,
like bite me,
and didn't shift back to you, how would you then correct them?
So that if they didn't come back.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
You
So
just wait till they came back?
Yeah, it depends. Yeah, or whichever trainer they went to, that trainer would deliver the LRS, right, or be neutral to them. And then once that 3 seconds has happened, we moved on like nothing had happened. They had a clean slate moving forward. We don't hold a grudge, like moving on. Nothing's a problem.
Right.
And the reason I want to share that with you is because it's 100% linked to my qualms or my concerns with what some trainers do that's reinforcing their dog, because it all depends on, if your dog is doing something wrong and you react by asking them to look at you or telling them to do a behavior in response to their having done something wrong, it depends on how reinforcing that behavior is to the dog, whether or not in general you're reinforcing your dog or not. So for a dolphin, we give them nothing and they got it, like, oh, I did it wrong. For a dog, if you re-diverted them or tried to distract them, it depends on what you use. Some people use food, and they might not give the dog the food, but they'll use the smell of the food to try to lure them away. And then once they turn away, they give them the treat, but they literally gave them the smell of the food. I mean, the dog in that moment sort of feels like it's almost the same as getting the treat. And in the case I talked about in my Periscope a few weeks ago, the trainer had told my client to spend 30 minutes a day working on a behavior with her dog. And that she called push-ups. So she wanted her dog to lie down and then sit, lie down and sit, lie down and sit, and then highly reinforce that behavior. Highly reinforce that behavior, right? And so that if the client did that and they spent 30 minutes every day highly reinforcing that behavior over and over and over again, hello.
Hey Kim, how are you?
I'm awesome, thanks. Then you can imagine that that push-ups on the dog's scale of like what's interesting or exciting or reinforcing the dog, push-ups would be pretty highly ranked as like, that's my favorite thing. So in this case, somebody was coming in their home and the dog was barking at them, kind of meanly, like alert barking, but like it sounded pretty vicious. And the trainer was telling them, like, in that moment, tell the dog to do push-ups so that he'd stop barking. And my take on that is, like, you're basically giving the dog the thing he likes the most, which is the most reinforcing behavior you could ask for him, right in the moment when he's doing something you don't want.
Right.
Right? So then questions came in about, like, well, I've been taught to reinforce a dog, to if a dog is barking, I've been taught to ask him to look at me. what if you move one way or do something? There's so many things on this spectrum that you could ask a dog or tell a dog to do in response to the dog doing something wrong. And my take will always be, where on the spectrum does it fall with regards to how reinforcing is that behavior to the dog? Mm-hmm. If you ask the dog to sit, let's say, 1,000 times a day, and he barely ever gets reinforced for it, but he's really good at it because they can just do it in their sleep. The dog is doing something wrong, you ask him to sit, that's not nearly as bad. It's not nearly as reinforcing to the dog as asking him for push-ups. If you're spending 30 minutes a day highly reinforcing push-ups. Right? And then for me, to avoid the entire problem, is one little thing is missing that makes a huge difference. And that is telling your dog no, or telling him he's wrong. So if he's barking and you tell him no and correct him for the barking, you can move forward and then at that point ask your dog anything you need or want to help manage the situation, even if it were a really highly reinforcing behavior like push-ups.
Because you told him no.
Because you've already told him no, you've paired it with some sort of a consequence that communicates super clearly to him that he wasn't supposed to be barking.
Yeah.
And now, in an ideal world, you might not move on to like the most reinforcing thing he has, but if that's what you need to do to manage the behavior and get it right, that's a place to start, but you're going to want to not have to piggyback a correction with something he loves, right next to each other in time. But it's not nearly as wrong. It's not officially wrong from a psychological analysis of behavior modification. If you put in there, nope, you're not allowed to bark. How about you do this instead?
Yeah. No, that's kind of clears it up a little bit. Real quick, Terry, I know you just joined. So I'm talking with Kim Greco here about not, as my title said, not reinforcing unwanted behaviors. So Terry and Ryan, if other people jump on, if you two don't mind chiming in, typing in a comment, letting other followers know. So as this person just jumped on here, if you'll just type that in and let them know what I'm talking about, so it doesn't just look weird that the camera's staring at me and I'm potentially saying nothing for 5 minutes. They know what's happening. So, all right. And I totally agree with not luring a dog away. So I think that goes into the quadrant of negative punishment, right? Because then you have the food, you take it away to decrease a behavior. So I totally kind of agree with that, of not doing that, because then I just feel like, oh, here's your growling the dog, come follow this food, or whatever that might be. So I typically don't like that way of redirecting them. Yep. But like I said, I think it makes more sense now of clarifying with a no and then giving them something else to do, because and I typically tell that to my clients. So some of the things that I had written down here, and so this, what you just talked about, kind of answers that question already. So I said, okay, so when do you call your dog, come to you on command, rather than thinking whatever. Oh, so one of the instances was, if my dog gets off place, you said you don't want to give them a command to do. So then I would say, if they broke place, I would say no, spot, and then send them back on, and they would go. So perfect timing.
Dad to the rescue.
Hi, bye-bye. So I would tell them no because they broke command, and then I would they can stay in here. Yeah. And then I would give them that command to get back on place. Now sometimes, if a dog breaks, say, a sit, I'll even sometimes just say or no, and they'll even go back into that sit automatically because they know. Mm-hmm. So at that point, do you say that me saying no, spot, and them getting back on is reinforcing a bad behavior of them breaking command?
It kind of depends on how far along they are in the training of the behavior for place. Okay? So if it's brand new, if I'm just starting to train it, I probably wouldn't say no if the dog got off. If anything, I'd probably say let's go, get back on. But if they know it, they've learned the criteria is that they're not allowed to get off until they're given the release command to get off, and they get off. Then they need the no to tell them, nope, you just did something wrong. And at that point, if you repeat the command, it's as minimally reinforcing as you can in that moment, because they need to know, like, oh, get back on. And if place is a really reinforcing behavior, there's a chance that, yes, that could be reinforcing if it happens to be their favorite behavior and they just love it. Oh, she said place, yay. But usually it's in context where you've just told them no, and they're like, oh, I got it wrong, and then you're telling them place. It's usually not going to land on them as reinforcement, primarily because you have told them no first. Yep. Okay. Yeah. So if you don't say no, right, if they just get off the place and you don't say no, you just say place and you put them back on, that could easily be reinforcing for them, because place is reinforcing. A lot of the reinforcement history they've had for learning that behavior, the reinforcement comes right after you've said the word place at the early stages of training. You say place, they get on, you feed them. You say place, if you're using food. You say place, they get on, you reinforce them. Reinforce them, right? Yeah. You guys are awesome, right? So that, if you don't say no, if they get off and you say place and they get back on, that would be reinforcing to them. Absolutely. Yeah. And chances are, if they're staying on their place for however long and then they sneak off and you're like place and they get back on, chances are that they'll end up getting more reinforcement from you for having broken the place than they would get from you for never breaking. Does that make sense? Because a lot of times, I'll tell my clients all the time to be on the lookout for this. The dog will do something wrong that's not terribly wrong, but it's wrong, so that they get on your radar. Because, so you tell them that they're wrong, and they're like, oh, my bad, I was wrong, and then they go back to being good. You need to be really careful that you're not more likely to reinforce them right away. Let's say they were lying on their place for 20 minutes perfectly, and you were just taking that for granted, cooking dinner, checking emails, doing whatever you want. Then they got off their place, and you were like, no place, and they got back on. But then 3 minutes later, you clicked and went over and gave them a treat, or you reinforced them, or you told them they could get off, because you're like, that was what I wanted. I really wanted you to stay. Really? Like, you reinforced them for staying for 3 minutes where you didn't reinforce them for staying for 20. Does that make sense? Because dogs are definitely smart enough to figure that out. Yeah. And people fall prey to that all the time. That's where
it gets challenging or tricky, because then it's like, well, how do you know when they're going to break?
Right. Yeah. So well, you have to kind of
reward before they do break.
Correct. You kind of have to have an idea of a general timeline of how long they'd hold it before they might get antsy, and reinforce them ahead of time. Or if some larger distraction entered the room, or you knew there was a larger distraction coming, that would shorten the duration. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about, like, stuff that I've gone through with clients. Like, one of those things, too, similar to place, is, like, stay. So, like, if I have Yes, Terry. So someone asked you to periodically praise. So yeah, that's where she's talking about reinforcing good behavior and knowing when your dog may break and trying to reinforce them before they get off place. So Terry, I did a video on place teaching a dog, and she has a 10-month-old Aussie. Do you ever phase out the food, Kim? So somebody asked that.
Absolutely. So I know people who watch me on Periscope probably already know this, but I'm a huge believer in, so I use a clicker a lot of times when I'm training, or at least a marker. And I will click and treat a dog whenever I am impressed with what they're doing. So if they're just learning the behavior, I'm pretty impressed they're doing it right. If they hold a place for the first time when, somebody walks in the room and picks up a baby and walks out again, and that impresses me, I'd reinforce them for it. A year from now, it'd be one of those, like, the whole house could be falling apart around them, and I wouldn't really be that impressed if they didn't get off because they knew the behavior so well. So I only reinforce with food at a time where I'm impressed. I find that very organically allows people to wean off of the food as reinforcement. It's a very natural way to do that.
Yeah, and then you also, I'm assuming, use like a duration marker like good to let them know they're doing the right thing, keep doing it, but they're not going to get food for it.
Right. They might get food for it, but they don't have to get food for it. But if I use yes, they have to get food. If I use the clicker, they have to get food.
Okay, right, yeah. I just want to make sure we're in the same boat there.
Yeah.
Oh, so what I'm saying with like the whole stay part. So if I'm doing a stay and the dog knows it fairly well, so like trying to think with clients and stuff, and the dog breaks a stay, I will typically tell the client, put your dog back in a stay or place, in this instance too. Make them stay there at least 30 seconds before you release them off again.
Okay. And when you tell them to go back to it, do you tell them they have to go back to the exact spot they had been when they broke?
Yes.
Okay. So that's interesting, which is quite common. For me, I'm not very attached to that it has to be the same spot, unless I think that the spot had something to do with why they left. So
and generally, I mean, I don't know other people's opinions on it, but generally the reason why I do the same spot is because what I find is dogs will learn to do that whole creeping.
Yeah.
Like they stay here, and then they get up, no, stay, and then they just do that creeping over and over.
Right. So I am a huge believer in also, for me, a dog's attitude can pretty much trump anything except for maybe recall. So if I call a dog, I want him to come no matter what. I have no excuses. But if I'm working on stay and or place and they stretch out and like a foot comes off, like, you know what? Like, as long as they have a good attitude about it and they're not, you can tell the difference if they're like sneakily trying to get away with breaking the rules versus what's their intention. So I'm a big, which gets into a gray area, and for some people, that's hard. They need, like, what exactly are the rules, and I have to follow the rules. Well, I can give them rules, but for me, if it's me working the dog, what's the intention? So if the dog, so for stay, to answer your question, I don't always tell them they have to go back to the exact same spot. Depends if that has anything to do with their intention for why they broke the stay. If it was distance from me that caused them to break, I could have them go to a different place, but the same distance. And then you say you want them to hold it at least 30 seconds before they would release them. For me, the reason I chuckled when you said that was, how long were they holding the stay before they broke? Because you could have just created exactly what my example was before, where you could have had a dog in a stay for 20 minutes, and if they break and your client then makes them hold it for 30 seconds, those dogs will break more often because it will end up getting them out of the behavior sooner.
But then do you kind of just take it as, like, your loss? So, like, say they were on a stay for 20 minutes, they broke, you got them back on, you realized you wanted to release them anyway, or you have to go. Mm-hmm. Would you just kind of like, my fault, my loss kind of thing?
Yeah, I probably wouldn't reinforce it after 30 seconds.
So if they broke it, then just SOL?
Well, I'd probably put them back in it, right? And then I certainly wouldn't give them any additional reinforcement other than the fact that they got to get up after that time if I had to go. But
additional reinforcement as in like
food
petting,
or
praise, or
yeah,
food.
Right,
kind of, okay.
Right. So I would be pretty neutral about it. If they were staying for 10 minutes and they broke and I put them down and I waited 30 seconds, but then I had to go and I released them from the stay, it would be pretty boring and uneventful and a little bit like, because I want that dog to be like, well, how come she's not acting like she normally does when she releases me?
Yeah. So you haven't found or seen a big difference in like putting them back in the same spot, with dogs like creeping forward, or if you see that, then you just tell them to put them back in the same spot? Yeah,
it depends. It's 100% linked to whatever their intention is on how they're handling. You know, if they're just creeping forward just because they want to creep and be closer and closer, then yes, you have to put them back in the same spot because they need to still be that same distance from you.
Yeah. Okay.
But if it's not, you know, if something happened and they got startled and they popped up and you want them to still work on it, like they don't have to go back to right where they were. They could go anywhere if that's why they hit. You know what I mean? If they got up for a different reason than creeping.
Because at that point too, like, and again, I'm just kind of going through this in my thoughts is, depending on what it could be, just depending on what you're training. So if you're just training a stay and not necessarily like distance, then if they break it, then just go back to working on stay rather than like, I'm working 10 feet away or whatever. Right.
Yeah. It definitely depends on what you're working. But from an ideal standpoint, I think a good rule of thumb would be if they broke that behavior that had duration involved in it, I would want to see them hold the behavior for at least the duration they had prior to the break to make them even. You know, if they were holding it for 5 minutes and they got up and broke, I would want to repeat it to just about 5 minutes before I would break them, not 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Right? Because you could easily condition your dogs that if they break, they're going to end up getting out of the behavior sooner.
Yeah, makes sense. Hey Maria, this is Kim Greco on my Skype video, and we're talking about reinforcing unwanted behaviors. So I'll hand this around, so that's her. She lives in Maryland, and so we're just discussing this kind of trainer to trainer, and thought it would be fun to record it on Periscope. So if you have questions as we go on, feel free to post those. Tap the screen to show us some hearts, and then you can tap the screen if we say reinforce ever. That's just a fun game to see.
We got lots of hearts on my time.
And so
do you guys have any questions?
Should be tapping the screen. And then so a question, Kim, from one of my viewers is, are you familiar with Duke's dog training Genesis?
I met Duke at the conference last year, and I watched him do a presentation with his dogs, and I had a really super awesome and very long private conversation with him one evening. So I'm not familiar with his online program, Genesis, per se, but I am very familiar with his philosophies and training style.
Cool.
Is that a good answer to your question?
Ryan, if you have anything more specific about that, let me know.
Yeah.
Okay. Another big one.
Yeah. Okay, another big one. Another big question. Yeah, bring it on.
Okay. So, puppies.
Yeah.
If a puppy is biting a hand or furniture or whatever, I'm going to, so if it's furniture, remove him from that furniture and give him a toy. And I even say, give him a toy that is similar texture to that object to redirect them and put them on something else.
Yep.
So, if you wouldn't do that, why and what would you do?
Okay, awesome. So I have a blog post that I wrote. I think it's in the queue, like waiting to go out. And the title of the blog post is Why Every Puppy Book is Wrong.
Okay.
Right? Because every puppy book that you pick up off of the shelf will tell you to do exactly what you just said. Your puppy's chewing on something, your hand or your leg or the couch or the rug. You should exchange it, basically hand them a dog toy to chew on instead. You go one step ahead and say, hey, what about the same texture? That might apply to some dogs, but some dogs it won't matter. They'll just want to be chewing on something. I do not agree with that. I don't do that. I don't teach that. And the reason is because if the toy that you hand your puppy is reinforcing, the puppy likes the toy, you have just 100% no doubt given your puppy something he wants in response to him doing something that you don't want.
Even if you say no and then give him the toy.
I would say no and correct him.
But like if you just say, like if he say chewing on the couch and you say no and then give him the toy, is that still potentially reinforcing it because the toy is such a high reinforcer? Right.
Yes, although the fact that you say no, it's way better than if you didn't say no. Right? And for me, I always, 100% of the time, pair some sort of consequence with the word no, because I personally don't believe that just the word no is enough information to the dog for the dog to know, like, hey, I don't really want you to do that. If it was, Crystal, you and I wouldn't have a job, because the people out there would have dogs and their dogs would do something wrong and they would say no, and then their dogs would never do that again, and we just wouldn't be in business. So for me, I always pair it with something, and with a puppy it would be something as little or as simple as like a squirt bottle. So if a puppy's chewing on the couch, I'm going to say no, and I'm going to squirt them with a water bottle. And then I'm going to wait.
And go finish?
I want to wait, and I want to see what they're going to do. Are they going to go right back to chewing again? Because if they are, I'm going to say no and squirt again. And if it happens more than twice, well, something has to change. So I usually would have them on a leash anyway, so I would just move them away from the couch at that point. But if I said no and squirted and the dog stopped chewing the couch and then turned and just walked away or moved over and laid down or on its own initiative went and got a toy, like now I have something I could click and treat. Because in that case, it's like, hey, I like that train of thought. it's almost like the puppy corrected itself as opposed to me having to micromanage that.
Yeah. Just writing it down.
That's all right. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Cool. Awesome. You guys have any questions out there on Periscope? You guys are awesome. I love all these hearts. So generous. Thanks so much. Yay. No questions. Or the broadcast is not connected. Okay, you're listening hard. Meaning, you're listening hard, does that mean it's hard to hear, or you're just concentrating on what we're saying? Because one of them is awesome, and the other, I would be concerned if you can't hear, I could turn my volume up or something. Are you just concentrating? She said listening hard, so I'm trying to figure out, like, what does that mean? No, it's great. Awesome.
Second. Ow!
Uh-oh. Yeah, what about harder corrections? Scott wants to know, what about harder corrections? You're listening too hard to the word reinforce. Thank you, Angie. You're awesome. Scott, what about harder corrections? So if you have a dog that needs harder corrections, is that what you're asking me? Because the system would be the same regardless of what. Hello.
Yes, hello.
The system would be the same regardless of what correction you're using. You would still say no and pair it with whatever consequence your dog needs so that it would effectively know what you meant. It would clearly know that you meant don't do that. If the dog breaks place, give a harder correction. Oh, depends on the dog and depends on how many times they're breaking place. I don't find that I have to escalate okay, so that's an awesome question. So here's the thing. If the dog is kind of repeatedly doing it wrong, they need something, but don't they need something to chew on soon after? Some dogs do and some dogs don't, so depends on the dog. But if they needed something to chew, they can find something appropriate, and you could reinforce them for picking the right thing. So Scott, if your dog is, so Scott Borden just asked me, if a dog is breaking place, let me answer this one first. If a dog is breaking place repeatedly, or they keep doing it, should you escalate the corrections? That's one way to do it, no doubt, and that would be effective. So I might say, the first time I put you back on, and then the next time I might say no and squirt with a water bottle, and then, you could escalate your corrections, and your corrections could get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse the more your dog keeps getting the behavior incorrect. So for me, I don't generally train that way. The reason I don't train that way is because I find that when you are working in the world of positive reinforcement as effectively as possible, you don't need your corrections to escalate, because all I need is a clear-cut system to tell my dog, yes, I like that you're doing that. No, I don't like that. And if I can communicate clearly, yes, I like that. No, I don't like that, then it's really easy to get them to understand what I want them to do. So if I have a dog that's repeatedly breaking place, instead of escalating my corrections, I would increase my positive reinforcement for holding place in other situations, or for shorter duration, or higher distractions, whatever. I would be more likely to increase my reinforcement for getting it right than I would be to escalate my correction. Awesome, awesome question. Thanks, Scott. Cool. Did you guys get all that? Did you follow that too?
Most of it.
Good. Yeah. So that's a common train of thought, is like, they're getting it wrong. Shouldn't we just increase? Should we make it worse and worse and worse for them the more they get it wrong, to try to motivate them to not do it?